Westminster, the seat of government for 55 million Britons, a model parliament admired everywhere in the world where democracy is held dear. But it's a model under attack. Britons were shocked last year when a terrorist's bomb rocked the foundations of the kingdom's most treasured institution. It was the work of Ulster extremists who were determined to force separation from the United Kingdom. And they couldn't have chosen a better target to symbolise their contempt for government from London. Though Northern Ireland already has a measure of political autonomy, the Irish Republicans are fighting for complete home rule. But they're not the only Britons dissatisfied with the nation's highly centralised form of government. Other parts of Britain complain they don't have a strong enough voice in their regional affairs. It's an undercurrent the government knows it can't ignore if it's to halt other nationalist parties before campaigns for independence become struggles to split Britain at its seams. With this fear in mind, the Westminster government's come up with proposals for devolution, more power to the people of Scotland and Wales, a greater say for them in the decision-making process. The big question is, will these plans for devolution create more effective government or disunite the kingdom? Under the plan, Westminster would continue to govern the whole British Isles, but Scotland and Wales would set up their own assemblies. The Scots and Welsh would elect members to the assemblies, which would administer some social services, housing, roads, health, schooling, and many aspects of physical planning. Both assemblies would be allotted block grants for their countries, and though they would have power to raise extra revenue of their own, their economy would still be controlled from London. Scotland signed away its independence in 1707, though it was never actually conquered by the English. Perhaps that's why the Scots have always maintained a strong national identity, with their own legal and educational systems and their own church. Its relationship with England's been a strange one, for while Westminster has encouraged much investment and directed economic aid north of the border, the Scots still blame England for their problems: high unemployment, poor city housing and depopulation. This is the Royal High School in Edinburgh, where Scotland's Assembly will meet if the government's proposals are adopted. 142 members will sit here with law-making powers, a cabinet-type government and a chief executive, a sort of Scottish Prime Minister. It would cost almost £5 million to set up and well over 20 million a year to run. But Scottish legislation could still be overridden by London, prompting the plan's critics to question the whole point of the system. It's not just the remoteness of Westminster that's making devolution such a pressing issue. It's changes in Scotland itself. Scottish frustration over the decline of traditional industry and the explosion of a new one. Oil from the North Sea will be a shot in the arm for Britain's ailing economy. But if all the oil revenue were kept by Scotland for itself, it would enable the Scots to virtually abolish taxation and set the country on course for industrial security and prosperity. Small wonder Scots are thinking twice about sharing what they see as their birthright with neighbouring England. Already what Britain calls North Sea oil, Scotland possessively terms Scottish oil. In fact, a recent survey showed that 1/3 of all Scots believe they should keep all the oil for themselves. They're talking about some £4,000 million a year in royalties and taxation by 1980, and clearly no British government based in London would be willing to let that slip through its fingers. What oil has done is to bolster the economic case for Scottish independence. It's transformed dramatically the fortunes of the Scottish National Party to the point where both the major British parties see it as a threat. A party which was once an upstart Celtic curiosity has recently netted a third of the Scottish vote in a general election. Now, when the SNP talks, everyone listens, even in London. For with 11 members in Parliament, only a small swing from Labour would give them an overall majority among Scottish MPs, enough to consider UDI regardless of government plans.
The need for self-government was never more apparent. The attention being paid to this need by the other parties was never stronger. In this booklet here, Scotland's Future, we are presenting a programme of social democracy for the people of Scotland. We make it quite clear that self-government underpins all the other needs of the people of Scotland.
For the idea of an assembly.
With their newfound credibility, SNP members are riding high. But what support do they have for their policy for nothing short of independence? Surveys show that only one Scottish voter in 5 actually favours it.
To transfer powers.
We spoke to SNP Member of Parliament, Margot MacDonald.
Mrs MacDonald, will an assembly with wide powers over home affairs satisfy the Scottish people, or will it merely increase the demands for complete independence?
I think the latter, because the Scottish people haven't made the division, the spurious division between home and foreign affairs, and decided that they must control one part of the affairs of the country. They have decided that they want to see the economy of Scotland meeting the expectations which our newfound oil fields, of course, have generated here in Scotland, and they've decided that they want to see an end to the over-centralisation of decision-making, which has robbed Scotland of initiative and talent and generally has made it a less nice place to live in.
But to be realistic, the Westminster government can't actually give the Assembly powers which will satisfy you, will it?
As a party, well, of course they could, because what we have asked them to do...
Only by granting independence?
No, we have asked them to set up a Scottish Assembly in the first instance with powers over the Scottish economy, with powers over how the Scottish oil fields are to be exploited and developed. And if they did that and gave the Assembly the right to raise its own taxation, then we would foresee an Assembly rolling on quite naturally in consultation with a government in Westminster until we had reached the stage at which people in Scotland were satisfied with the type of government and the powers vested in a Scottish government that we would have.
Are you saying then you'd be prepared to stop short of independence?
Well, logically, you see, I happen to agree with Enoch Powell in this. There's no such thing as 10% nationalism, and devolution as an end in itself would simply mean that the real power was retained in Westminster. And so therefore, logically...
There's a rising tide of nationalism in that other Celtic country, Wales, a land of song, rugby, chapels, steel and coal. It would be understandable if Wales's nationalism stemmed, perhaps like Scotland's, from a feeling of exploitation. For it was Welsh coal, hard won, that fueled Britain's industrial revolution. But by emotional Welshmen, the campaign's being waged more in the name of culture and national pride. This stone in mid-Wales marks the spot where the last Welsh prince died 700 years ago during a border skirmish with Englishmen. Afterwards, Wales joined Britain. Ordinary people in the Principality retained their Welsh identity thanks to the translation of the Bible into Welsh and the growth of a radical tradition centred on the chapel, a tradition still strong today, especially in the remoter areas. The victory of a Welsh Nationalist MP, Gwynfor Evans, at Carmarthen in 1966 shook the confidence of Wales's Labour members and regenerated support for the Clyde Cymru party. The Nationalists were fired by a determination to protect the Welsh language and culture. Demonstrators tore down road signs and demanded they should be reworded in Welsh. The militants gradually gained support among broadcasters, writers, students, teachers, members of the chapel, even folk singers and poets. They succeeded, and new road signs in Wales are bilingual. More important, Clyde Cymru is now a political force in its own right. The government became sufficiently concerned to set up a royal commission, which recommended an elected assembly for Wales. Clyde Cymru is strongest in the rural west and north. In the Welsh-speaking country areas, there's plenty of vocal backing for Clyde Cymru. But when it comes to polling time, supporters don't always put their votes where their words are. Only 11% voted Nationalist at the last elections, and there are only 3 Clyde Cymru MPs. But like the more successful Scottish Nationalists, the aims of the party leader, Gwynfor Evans, are clear.
Well, the one thing that transcends everything else, of course, is a parliament for Wales. We have to get control of policy in Wales, of certain areas of policy at any rate, and that's only possible through a parliament. So we're putting that right in the forefront of our whole policy.
The Nationalists vote.
At the Welsh office in Cardiff, 1,500 civil servants, controlled by a Secretary of State for Wales, spend £250 million a year on roads, industry, health, education and housing, while this will be the home of the Welsh Assembly, according to the government's policy document, the White Paper. The critics say it would be little more than a talking shop with no legislative teeth.
Mr. Evans, what's your main reaction to this white paper?
The first thing that strikes one is that there's no big difference between this white paper and the last one that we had 14 months ago. No major difference at all. So that really 14 months have been lost. One could have written this in October 1974. And there is another year of delay, of course, so that one wonders what the government's policy is. But it is a fact, of course, that this does mean a very considerable step forward in democratic control over a stratum of government that already exists. It exists in the Welsh office, it exists in all the nominated bodies, but it is bureaucratic government at present. This will give the people of Wales some control over that layer of government.
Well, you say it's a step forward. Aren't you satisfied, therefore, that this is enough, in fact?
Oh, it's far from being enough. It's a great shame that the government, having decided to establish an elected assembly, shouldn't make it an effective one. And an effective assembly means that it would have control over the economy, at least a measure of control over the economy, and over industry. That isn't given us. And for that reason, we won't be able to tackle the major problems that we're faced with. We're faced with great problems of depopulation and unemployment. Yesterday's figures show that we've gone up again to 7.9%, which is the highest in any area, any region in Britain here. Well, we can't do anything about it through this Welsh Assembly, and this is what we should be tackling.
You seem to be judging the white paper not on its merits, but as a means towards your objective of complete self-government.
Oh no, the Assembly should be a means to tackle the serious problems of Wales. It should be an instrument for that purpose, and for that purpose it has to be effective. Naturally, we want to have more than even that kind of Assembly would give, even if it had control over the economy and industry.
It's the more important situation in Scotland that's worrying the Westminster government. Although a pre-election promise committed them to discussing the setting up of regional assemblies, they've no genuine desire to devolve power from England. For once a Scottish assembly became dominated by nationalists, independence would be the next step. On the other hand, not to allow a measure of self-government might be to risk action which could turn Scotland, and far less likely Wales, into another Northern Ireland. But time is on the side of the nationalists. As long as Britain's economic crisis remains, the nationalists can blame England for all Scotland's ills and point to Scottish oil wealth as a means of salvation. We spoke to the leader of the Scottish group of MPs, Dr. Dick Mabon.
Dr. Mabon, will this white paper be enough? Will the Scottish people be satisfied with what it proposes, in particular the Assembly and all its powers for Edinburgh?
I think overwhelmingly yes. I think that there will be some reluctant ones who don't want any changes, and there'll be the nationalists who never will be satisfied. But on the whole, the bulk of the Scottish people, being sensible as they are, will regard this as an adventurous and acceptable proposal.
Isn't it bound, in a sense, to be the thin end of the wedge, that it's going to be a first step down the slope which leads to total independence?
I don't think so. I think the Scots voted to stay in the European common market, and by that decision, to my mind, they surrendered the idea of 19th century national independence, whatever that is in this century. And they are prepared to work within Europe, and I would think within the United Kingdom as well.
But don't you think there's been a move within Scotland which says we do want more control over our own affairs?
Undoubtedly, yes, and Parliament at its peril will ignore this.
But there is a danger, surely, that English MPs will delay this bill so it won't get through next year. What will happen then?
Well, to be fair, it's not entirely the English. There are some Scots and some Welsh Conservatives, I mean in the small c, who don't want any changes. But a large number of Englishmen with the best of intentions will probably look very unsurely at this bill and perhaps even block it, as you say. That would be very dangerous if they did that, because I think then the demand in Scotland would become keener among the moderates, not among the nationalists. So they'll always be keen, but among the moderates, they'll be keen to demand more, and this is a mistake. England has made many mistakes in the past in its history of this character, and it would be a great mistake if their best neighbours, the Scots, were to be treated in the same historical way.
And what of the people? Oil workers have been following the debate, so we spoke to some to gauge reaction to the government's plans for their future.
I would like to see us stay as we are. You know, I don't believe in these separate committees and so forth like that. We are definitely a British nation, and we should be the one thing.
I think Scotland should govern themselves. When we see the state of the country's in at the moment, we've had a Labour government from England, we've had a Conservative government from England, and I think things are going actually from bad to worse. We should have a parliament in Scotland headed by Scottish people, manage our own affairs. We've got the industry up here, we've got the oil up here, we've got everything we need up here, and people might turn around and say, well, England's been good to us in the past, which is probably correct. But don't forget one thing, we've also been good to England. So I think it's high time that we had a government of our own. And I think now that the public opinion is going to sway that way, and 2 or 3 general elections in 2 or 3 years' time, I think we'll go home high and dry.
I think we should have a parliament in Edinburgh, but not be completely separate, because historically we're tied together for such a long time. And but I think if they do devolve the power to Scotland, I think they'll eventually become separate. I think they've made a mistake.
Now that the separatists in Scotland and Wales know what's in store for their countries, the political action is sure to hot up. Among the English, the main fears are that devolution will add another bureaucratic burden, another pointless tier of government, and that at worst it might dismember the United Kingdom. If the Nationalists have their way, decision-making will be by Scots and Welsh in their respective capitals, with a supreme legislature at the Common Market HQ in Brussels. If that happens, Westminster will become a purely English parliament, and the days of the Union Jack will be numbered.